Be with you again for the gathering of the National Trail of Tears Association. Mary Kay, you're right. You just said, you asked the chief if something was good, and I've not gotten this far by going against Mary Kay Henderson. I'm always on her side, so she gets the thumbs up. This is an important organization to me personally. If I wasn't the chief of the Cherokee Nation, if I was a Cherokee citizen holding no office, this would be an important organization to me because of what you all represent and the work that you do. As chief, it is even more so that I have this understanding and admiration of how important your work is. Congress passed a law, it was 1987, the Trails Act. The National Trail of Tears Association established, if somebody will correct me if I'm wrong, 1993. So decades of work, and it just shows you that Congress can pass laws. We can, as a nation, aspire to do better. In the case of the National Trail of Tears Association and the trail system, it was to interpret properly for everyone and for future generations the Trail of Tears, what it means to this country, what it says about the country, what it says about the country now, or then, and when the law was established, that we want to be thoughtful about it, purposeful about it. We want to tell the truth about it. But you can pass all the laws in the world, and it won't matter unless people buy into it, commit themselves to effectuating those laws. And that's what the National Trail of Tears Association is, and all of the chapters associated with it. And what that really means is the men and women in this room and others who may not be able to join us today represent the real doing part of that aspiration. And so I want you to know that you're important to me and you're important to the Cherokee Nation. We've been proud to support the National Trail of Tears Association, and we have done so financially and in other ways, but financially, I'm proud that once again we'll provide a $25,000 donation. That makes, in the last 3 years, $190,000 worth of support. I know this organization stretches those dollars, does important things with those dollars, and I know that in the future we would do well to continue to support you. I'm very impressed by Missouri Humanities Council for the contribution that they have made and the support they've made, not only financial, but what they do to really bring, elevate, I should say, this organization in the public consciousness. It's important that we have friends. Us Cherokees need all the friends we can get. There's a lot of friends in this room. There's a lot of friends across the country, including Missouri Humanities. I want to take an opportunity to just share with you a few of the things that I think are really important in Cherokee history. And the Trail of Tears figures into at least what I, as chief, think is important. But I always think of it through the lens of what do I want. And fortunately, it's one of the great parts about this job is I do have occasion to talk to young people, the young Cherokees, about the Cherokee Nation, their status as a citizen of this nation. And a lot of young people across the country and a lot around the world even, but particularly in the country, are trying to figure out what their place is in a world that's changing a great deal. It's not only changing a great deal, that's a constant across humanity. It does seem to be changing at such a rapid pace. They say that the entire body of world knowledge, everything we know, doubles about every year. And that's remarkable. And you see different studies, they'll say it doubles in a shorter period of time. But it's just the rapid growth of all that we know and all that we're applying to know more, technology. So they live in a world in which in their lives it's just incredibly rapid change. But they also live in a country in which there's a fair amount of division. And there's a fair amount, I think, of uncertainty and sometimes pushback against marginalized communities identifying themselves as marginalized communities, identify themselves as minorities, identifying themselves as citizens of an Indian nation or Native Americans. That seems to me what we're dealing with right now. And if we're dealing with it as people who are maybe a bit on in years, imagine what young people are dealing with right now. And of course, my primary concern is what young Cherokees are dealing with. I think the history of their nation teaches them a great deal, and I hope it instills in them this idea that they come from good stock, that they come from a people who faced a great deal of adversity, a great deal of hardship. They came to different crossroads, but they managed to stare down the folks who would stand in their way or work their way around them and survive. And I think it's something that young Cherokees need to remember. That's who they come from. That's who they are. And so they're facing in their lives some degree of uncertainty, some degree of seeing crossroads in front of them. And I hope it helps them. And I think it should be something that we share with our young Cherokees, where they come from. So for me, where I like to start is before removal. I like to talk to them about the fact that we weren't just rounded up in stockades one day and marched across the country. There was a great resistance by the Cherokee Nation, which means there was a great resistance by the Cherokee people against the forces that would wipe them out or push them across the map. They should know that at a time when the government of the United States was getting stronger and was trying to assert its will to suppress people and to push people around that they thought they could push around, that's the truth, that there was a great resistance by the Cherokee Nation. We didn't simply find ourselves in stockades one day and marched across the country. We resisted. I like to share with young Cherokees that even though we know what happened in the midst of that resistance, that it still built something in our national character that stays with us today. We developed this really strong sense that we owed something to each other, that we had to have each other's back if we were going to steel ourselves against those encroachments. There's lots of different periods or things in history that happened on the way to removal. One of the things I like to share with young Cherokees is that part of this resistance put up by Cherokees against this strong government was not war, wasn't taking up arms, although we were great warriors. Everybody in this room knows parts of our history in which we've had to take up arms. But it was leaning into diplomacy. It was leaning into democracy. I like to tell young people that, and this is the truth, the Cherokee Nation today is one of the oldest democracies in the world. Not one of the oldest in Indian country, one of the oldest in the world, starting in the first quarter of the 19th century. That says something, and I hope it tells them something about where they come from, who their people are, what their ancestors believed in. It also probably tells them something about the fragility of democracy. If the Cherokee Nation, the democracy that began in the first quarter of the 19th century, is one of the oldest on the planet. Young people should, I think, particularly right now, be thinking about that, the fragility of democracy, that democracies have risen and fallen, but that their ancestors believed in it. Believed in it not just because it was the best way to arrange society, but because they thought it might strengthen the Cherokee Nation. I think they were right. Believing in and practicing democracy strengthens a nation. I think it did in our case. I like them to also think about this. We not only developed a democracy, we had different ways of sort of popular decision making before our constitutional democracy, but we decided to have a constitutional democracy. We decided to arrange our laws based on the rule of law, the written rule of law. That was a radical change. Their ancestors were radical. because changing the way we governed ourselves in the first quarter of the 19th century in such a dramatic fashion, from a decentralized way of looking at the world to a more centralized way of governing ourselves so that we could protect ourselves, was pretty radical. And their ancestors did that. And that took a great deal of courage. It also took some genius. And the genius was Sequoyah. I like to know about Sequoyah. Sequoyah, who gave us our written language, gave us something more powerful than any weapon that any Cherokee ever wielded. More of a defense than any shield that any Cherokee warrior ever had. And that was the ability to talk to each other in writing and to spread thoughts and ideas around our society. Literacy, spreading like wildfire, was central to this building up the strength of the Cherokee Nation. I want them to think about the idea that intellect, learning new ways, having the courage to do it, actually made the Cherokee Nation stronger in this period before removal. We got to tell our story, translating it into English all over the country and even all over the world. Why? Because we decided to have a newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix, which of course is still printed today. Those were remarkable, pioneering, and in some cases radical transformations. And their ancestors did that. And they did it because they thought, this is how we stand our ground. I think that's remarkable. And I think when young people in particular are facing a world when giving up might seem like an option, and we have to face it, for some of our young people, giving up seems like an option. Giving in to violence might seem like an option. Forgetting that you live in a community and you're all in it together, and deciding that it's just every man for himself might seem like an option. But it's not our tradition. And I want them to know that. And I want them to know it because that's where they come from. There was a lot of things that happened in that part of Cherokee history. We remember when the white settlers in Georgia found gold in the Dahlonega Hills. Now, usually when people find gold in their backyard, as the Cherokees did, you say, oh, eureka. But if you're a Cherokee and it's the 19th century and you're surrounded by white Georgians, you don't say, oh, eureka. You say, oh, something else. Because you know there's going to be this quest for your resources. They knew at the time what was happening. By then, the die seemed to be cast. And people were writing off the Cherokee Nation as a nation that was not only going to be pushed across the map, but pushed down into a footnote in some history book someday. And that's what some people in the country thought. But what I like young people to know is that our ancestors didn't give up, even though it seemed like the world was closing in around us. I mean, my goodness, we took this country to its own courts to show it that we were being treated unjust, that there was an injustice being visited upon us. We took them to their own courts. The Cherokee cases of the 19th century, Worcester versus Georgia, a case in which the United States Supreme Court had to face up to the idea that Indian nations were just that, nations, that we had a right to a land title and to exercise sovereignty. Their ancestors helped do that. I'd like them to know something else at this point. Because in Indian country today, we should be proud of where we are, and we should be proud of taking care of ourselves. And the Cherokee people and the Cherokee Nation do a great deal of taking care of ourselves, taking care of our own people. But I'd like to remind them that Worcester versus Georgia was about a man named Samuel Worcester who was willing to give up his liberty and even his life for a principle. And the principle was that the Cherokee Nation could govern its own affairs and exclude the state of Georgia. And Samuel Worcester wasn't Cherokee. It turns out one of the great heroes in the Cherokee story was one of our friends. I want them to know that Cherokees need all the friends we can get. And we've got a lot of friends, and we've had a lot of friends. The question is whether we have the wisdom to seek out and embrace that friendship. And I want them to know that when we do, and there may be some non-Cherokees in this room, I bet there are, when we do, we're stronger for it. We're not weaker for it. I want them to think about the fact that their ancestors believed in democracy. They believed in sometimes you've got to be radical and transform the way your world is, but you got to take control of it if you want to do it. That you shouldn't lean into violence when you can lean into diplomacy and intellect. And I want them to know that they need all the friends they can get. And I think their ancestors can teach them that. And that is all before the story of their ancestors being rounded up in stockades, which is where a lot of the story begins and almost ends when you talk about the Trail of Tears. But I want them to know that first part. I want them to know, of course, about the injustice that was visited upon their ancestors. That we were, as I've said half a dozen times now, rounded up in stockades. That a quarter of our population, from that point to our removal across the years 1838 to 1839, a quarter of our population wiped out, dead. Men, women, children, grandmas, grandpas, grandbabies, aunts and uncles, wiped off the face of the earth. The National Park Service earlier this year in March was handed an order that they had to comply with. The order said, paraphrasing, that all of the National Park Service sites ought to be examined, and this part's a quote, to see if any of the signs, markers, or monuments at National Park Service sites, quote, inappropriately disparage Americans past or living. Now, I think 9 of these sites are Trail of Tears sites. People in this audience know better than I do. How in the world can the United States tell the story, as it should, as it committed to do in 1987, as you carry out the mission since 1993, how in the world can the United States tell the story of the Trail of Tears without making somebody feel bad about it? How can they tell the story without maybe disparaging the governor of Georgia back in the 1830s? How can they tell it without disparaging Andrew Jackson's federal Indian policy? I don't see how you can do it. This week I'll send a letter to the National Park Service asking why they didn't ask the Cherokee Nation for consultation on that policy. If they would have asked me, well, you already know what I'd say. I just said it. We're going to put it in a letter. And we're going to ask the National Park Service, who's really just carrying out this order from on high, if this is really the right policy for the United States. I don't think it is. I think, as it turns out, this country got stronger when it started to tell the truth about the Trail of Tears and a great many other traumatic periods of history. And I think we're getting weaker if we try to whitewash it. It's not just the National Park Service sites. It's things that's going on across this country and libraries and other historic sites and other recitations of history. I'm concerned about it. But what I want young people to know is that the truth still matters. There's still right and wrong, and there's still fact and fiction. And there may be times in their lives, when people in very powerful positions try to tell them that up is down and black is white and left is right, and try to confuse the facts. But they ought to spend some time seeking the truth, even if people in very powerful positions are trying to tell them otherwise. And we Cherokees know a thing or two about that. This isn't the first time we've seen it. I like young Cherokees to also know that after our removal, when you would predict that a society that had been ripped apart, had a quarter of its population wiped off the earth, had its economy destroyed, had its political system ripped apart, and resulted in people being at each other's throats. Remember, Cherokees in 1839 were not just figuratively at each other's throats. They were at each other's throats. They had hatchets. There was political violence in the Cherokee Nation. There's some political violence in the country right now, and it really concerns me. I mean, if I was a young person, I'd be even more concerned. I'd be looking into a future wondering if this is what the country's going to be. But I would take them back to 1839 and tell them that the political violence that was visiting Cherokee Nation, the divisions that our ancestors had, would eclipse the violence and division we have today. And there's a good amount of it today. What I really want them to think about is, what did their ancestors do in response to that? Because young people right now are thinking about, what should we do in response to this? But I want a young Cherokee to think about not what they might do, not speculating about what people do, but what did their people actually do? I mean, here's what they did. They decided, the Cherokee people, my ancestors and yours, decided that we had more in common than what divided us. That we had this incredible past that began at creation. Precious things like our language handed to us at that time, and our culture. And that mattered, and that our history mattered. And that we were facing present dangers that we better have each other's back about. I mean, we were in a new land, new dangers and new worries, and we better collectively guard against those things. And then the other thing, the third thing that our ancestors did, is that they knew they had a future together if they chose it. But they had to choose it. And if they didn't choose it, they would be that footnote in history that a great many people in the United States not only predicted they would be, but were actually planning for them to be. So that's what our ancestors did. So they set aside this tremendous division. In 1839, July of 1839, we signed the Act of Union. The old settlers had a government. The Ross Party had a government. There was violence between the Treaty Party and the Ross Party. You know this history. But a lot of our young people don't know this history. And a lot of our young people don't know that the future of the Cherokee Nation was in doubt in 1839, and yet our ancestors found a way to get together. It's remarkable to me that they did it. If they could do it, we could do it in the United States today. And young people need to know that there is a path forward, that you can choose to lean into those things that you have in common. And there's a lot of things we have in common in this country, much more than divides us. By the way, we visited the Act of Union site just a few months ago, in July, on the anniversary. That Act of Union site is rightfully on the National Register of Historic Places in the United States. We put it on the Cherokee Nation National Historic Registry. And then I share with young people that in 1839 we signed the Constitution. The Constitution that, though has changed, has been part of our government ever since, except when the United States suppressed us nearly out of existence, not quite. We rebuilt Cherokee society. And how did we do it? We once again said democracy is important. The rule of law, the Constitution is important. Cameron Fight James is important. Water is important. It's that Missouri pollen that's getting me today. But they went back to what, even though in this country it failed them. I mean, the rule of law failed us in this country. Democracy didn't save us before removal, but we still believed in it. We still thought it was the right thing to do. And so their ancestors leaned back into it. What else did we do? 70 cents of every dollar went into something that 70 cents of every dollar ought to go in today, and that is public education. That's what their ancestors did. That's how they built society. They did all sorts of things that you do to build a great society, build systems to take care of each other, build communities, invest in things of the common good, what today we would call infrastructure, what back then was just how we built and rebuilt the Cherokee Nation. Their ancestors did that. In the wake of so much division and violence, that's what they focused on. Founding the female seminary, the first institution of higher learning for any woman of any race west of the Mississippi. You know it as Northeastern State University. They did that. They created a system of free public education in what would become Oklahoma before anyone ever heard of the state of Oklahoma. So I like them to know what their ancestors did, not just the tragedy of removal, even though they need to know that, and this country needs to remember it. And thanks to the work of this organization, the country won't forget it, even if there's folks that want us to. So that's what I like to share with young people. I think the story of the Cherokee people, both before removal, how we survived removal, and how we were intent on thriving after removal, is something young Cherokees need to know now more than maybe any other generation. Because it's interesting. I think that the generation of Cherokees coming up now have a great deal of anxiety about the world. They have a great deal of uncertainty about the world they live in. They've got a great deal of doubt, maybe if even being proud to be a Native American in this country is something that in the future is going to be accepted. But they're also a generation that's unique in this respect. They're the generation that's the best equipped, the most educated, with the most opportunities for economic success, professional success, than any generation of Cherokees for the last 5 centuries. Since the dawn of the so-called age of removal, this generation of Cherokees coming up has the best shot at making this the greatest Cherokee century of all. But we got to have their backs, and we got to keep doing our job as leaders and people in Cherokee communities and people in this organization. I'll share with you a few things that we're doing to make sure that we don't forget about our history. I mentioned that we're going to reach out to the National Park Service. We support this organization and all the work that it does. One of the initiatives that Deputy Chief Warner and I have is we are going to undertake something that I think has to be a national effort. We have a lot of little cemeteries dotting the landscape of the Cherokee Nation, and in many of those cemeteries, those pioneers, those brave men and women, those people that saved this nation are laid to rest, and many of those cemeteries are in disrepair. The Cherokee Nation, and it's going to take a while and it's going to take resources, we're going to make a national effort to save every single one of those cemeteries. Every single one of them. It's going to take all of them. It's called the Cherokee Nation Historic Cemetery Act. And it will take a long time, but we're going to set the table and put resources on the table so that we go assess these cemeteries, find out what condition they're in, and find out what it's going to take to make sure that these cemeteries are still there for future generations as a reminder of who's laid to rest there and what they did. I have some more exciting news that we announced the other day. The Cherokee Heritage Center. Anybody been to the Cherokee Heritage Center? You haven't been there for a while. The Cherokee Heritage Center is coming back, a $50 million replacement. In 2020, we worked with the Cherokee National Historical Society to bring the Cherokee Heritage Center into the hands of the Cherokee people through its government. We put us on a path to restore it. We put the Historical Society in charge of what it looks like. And once again, the Historical Society has done its job. We owe the Historical Society a great deal. In 1963, when the Cherokee Nation government was so suppressed, we couldn't do much. The Cherokee National Historical Society. There's people in this room that may remember or knew some of those folks. Protected our archives, protected our artifacts, protected what it meant to be Cherokee for generations to come. Thank goodness they did that. Thank goodness they did that. So now we can rebuild the Heritage Center and have a great home for all of that and a great deal more. Because these young Cherokees coming up need to have a way to preserve the history and to explore it and to celebrate it. And the Heritage Center is going to be there for them. We'll build that over the course of the next few years. We also need to make sure that we're building up this nation strong. And I wish I had more time to tell you what all is going on in the Cherokee Nation that I think is going to build future strength. But it's not much different than what our ancestors did after removal. What we're doing at the Cherokee Nation, it didn't just start on my watch in the last 6 years, but we're continuing to do is invest in those things that build a great society. We're investing mightily into higher education, public education, job training. We're investing into healthcare in ways that are really amazing and I think transformative. We're creating not just this great system of healthcare in Indian country. We've got some gaps, we've got some work to do, but we're creating a world-class system of wellness. We're creating a situation to where it's holistic, it's comprehensive. And I remember a time when I went to the Claremore Indian Hospital, the Indian Health Service facility, and I have good news there. On Wednesday, we're going to take the keys to the Claremore Indian Hospital away from the United States and put it where it belongs, in the Cherokee Nation's hands. We'll build a $244 million replacement facility. We'll immediately put $11 million in, and I got to tell you, I took great joy in telling the United States Senate on Indian Affairs, Committee on Indian Affairs this the other day. I said, we're going to invest $11 million into it to take it from the federal standard to the Cherokee standard, because it's a much higher standard. They know it. They know it's true. We're investing in housing in a way that we really need to invest in. A lot of the communities that those ancestors of ours founded before anyone ever heard of the state of Oklahoma, after the Trail of Tears and the decades that would follow, many of them are suffering from what a lot of rural communities suffer from, and they're withering on the vine. In the 20th century, they withered on the vine to a great extent. I'm talking about a lot of little towns, little communities. The Cherokee people founded, but they withered on the vine at a time when the Cherokee Nation was shackled by the government of the United States in terms of our ability to govern our own affairs. Well, the shackles are off. In this century, if those communities fail, we can't point to the federal government. We've got to look at ourselves, and so we're going to invest millions of dollars in not just housing, but things that make community life what it should be. Safe places for families to gather, places for kids to play, places for elders to maybe get a good meal. There's a lot more to do when it comes to restoring these communities. We've got some problems on the reservation in different communities. We've got issues with some crime and some drug addiction, but we're working on that too. I feel very optimistic about the future of the Cherokee Nation. I think that if we take these lessons, those of us in leadership, take these lessons from our ancestors about what sort of government and what sort of society did they want to build. They wanted to build a society in which we believed that we had a lot in common, that we had this great history that was handed to us, or we had this great society, this great culture, this great set of lifeways, this amazing language handed to us by our Creator, placed in our hands, and that we had to have each other's back and continue that on if we were going to survive. I like, again, to tell young people that from that journey, from creation to now, our ancestors saw a great deal. The Trail of Tears was one of many times in which the Cherokee Nation was almost that footnote in history. But folks, today we're not a footnote in history, we're making history. I think we're going to continue to make history in this century. But as excited as I am about the future, historic preservation is very important to me. Man, I want you to know that I support this organization. The Cherokee Nation supports this organization. I think your work is indispensable to making sure we interpret what the Trail of Tears was, what it means for the future, how it informs how we understand not only the history of this country, but where we're going in this country, and how we shouldn't return to some of those dark times that may not be another Trail of Tears, but may be another period of suppression by the United States against Native peoples. The only way to guard against that is to remember where we came from and to raise a generation that knows better and can do better. We can only do that if we have their backs. I'm committed to do that. I'm committed to having your back. I want you to know that as Chief of the Cherokee Nation, I feel very blessed. I've been chief for 6 years. I have 2 years left. I'm going to run as hard as I can through the finish line, doing as much as I can with great people that I get a chance to work with. Other than being a father and a husband and a grandfather, being chief of the Cherokee Nation is the most important thing I've ever done. It's the most important thing other than caring for my family that I get up and do every day. And I want to do my part, working with you, working with people in our elected leadership, working with Cherokees all over, not only the reservation, but across the country. I want to do my best to make sure that we can say when I leave office, not that we've reached the peak, but that our best days are still ahead of us. Thank you all very much. What else?